David Foster walks out of the courtroom in shock. He has lost custody of his daughter. His world crumbles around him until a small hand tugs at his jacket. A homeless girl, Scarlett, looks up at him with piercing eyes. "I know how you can get your daughter back," she says. David hesitates. How could this girl possibly know something that could change his fate? Then she whispers something that makes his heart stop. "Want to know what happened? Watch until the end. And don't miss this story full of emotions and unexpected twists." Comment your city below and subscribe for more thrilling stories. The courtroom was eerily silent, the air thick with anticipation. The only sound was the rhythmic tapping of the judge's gavel as he prepared to deliver his ruling. David Foster sat rigidly in his chair, his hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. His heart pounded against his ribs, drowning out everything else. This was it, the moment that would decide his daughter's fate. Across from him, Melissa Walker, his ex-wife, sat with an air of quiet confidence. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her posture composed. She looked every bit the devoted mother, the one who had fought tirelessly for their daughter's well-being. But David knew better. He knew the woman behind the mask. The judge cleared his throat. After careful review of the evidence presented, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Melissa Walker. Custody of Lily Peterson is awarded solely to her mother, with supervised visitation granted to Mr. Foster. The words hit David like a freight train. He didn't move, he couldn't. It was as if his entire body had turned to stone. A ringing noise filled his ears, muffling the murmurs that spread through the courtroom. The judge's voice faded into the background as the weight of the decision settled over him like a suffocating blanket. Melissa's lips curled into the slightest smirk, so quick, so subtle, that if he had blinked, he might have missed it. She had won, and she knew it. David stood slowly, his movements mechanical. His attorney, Laura Phillips, touched his arm lightly, murmuring something about appealing the decision, about not giving up. But her words barely registered. His mind was consumed by a single thought. Lily was gone. As he walked toward the exit, his vision blurred. He barely noticed Melissa walking away, barely noticed the reporters hovering outside, waiting for their sound bites. And then, as he stepped onto the cold pavement, a small hand grabbed his coat. "Sir," a voice said, quiet but steady, "I know how to get your daughter back." David blinked, his grief momentarily pierced by confusion. He turned to find a young girl standing before him, no older than 10 or 11. Her hoodie was tattered, her face smudged with dirt. But her eyes, dark, sharp, far too knowing for her age, held his firmly. For the first time since the verdict, his heart skipped a beat. "What did you just say?" The girl tilted her head. "I know the truth about your ex-wife." David's breath hitched. He should have walked away. It was crazy, a homeless child claiming to have the answers he so desperately needed. But something in her stare told him she wasn't lying. His fingers curled into fists. Hope was a dangerous thing. But right now it was the only thing he had left. David Foster stared at the girl in front of him, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and cautious hope. The world around him blurred. The courthouse, the passing cars, the murmuring voices. All that mattered was the girl's words. "What do you mean you know the truth?" His voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. The girl, small and thin, tucked her hands into the sleeves of her oversized hoodie. Her face was streaked with dirt, but her expression was calm, almost calculating. "I've seen things," she said simply. "Heard things." David glanced around, suddenly aware of the eyes on him. The press lingered near the courthouse steps, cameras, flashing as they documented his loss. If they caught wind of this conversation, it would be all over the news. Millionaire falls for street kids' lies, or something equally humiliating. But something about her felt different. "Who are you?" he asked. "Scarlett. No last name, no unnecessary details, just Scarlett." David exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. He should walk away. He had lost in court, lost the fight, lost Lily. This was done. Finished. And yet, "All right, Scarlett," he said, voice tight. "What exactly do you think you know?" She shifted, glancing over her shoulder like she was making sure no one was listening. Then she took a step closer. "Your ex-wife is working with people who make things go away. David felt a chill creep up his spine. What does that mean? It means she didn't win because she deserved to. She won because someone made sure she would. Scarlett's gaze was unwavering. And I can prove it. The words slammed into David's chest like a hammer. He had been trying to figure out how he had lost. He had the best lawyers. He was stable, successful, a good father. There was no logical reason the court should have ruled against him. Unless Melissa had rigged the outcome. His pulse thundered in his ears. He wanted to dismiss it, to tell Scarlett she was just a kid with a wild imagination. But what if she wasn't? Prove it, he said, his voice low. Scarlett studied him for a moment, as if measuring his resolve. Then she reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out a photograph. David took it cautiously, his hands unsteady. When he looked down, his breath caught. It was a grainy, low-quality photo, but the image was clear enough. Melissa, sitting in an upscale restaurant, shaking hands with a man David didn't recognize. But it wasn't just any meeting. In the background, David saw the judge from his custody case. His stomach turned. Where did you get this? His voice was sharp now, urgent. Scarlett hesitated. I see things people don't. I hear things people ignore. David didn't know if he should be grateful or terrified. Scarlett reached for the photo, but he pulled it back. No, he said. This is mine now. For the first time since leaving that courtroom, something other than grief burned in his chest. Determination. Melissa had taken his daughter from him. Now he was going to find out how, and he was going to take her back. David sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The photograph lay on the passenger seat, taunting him. He had stared at it so long that the image had burned into his mind. Melissa, smiling, shaking hands with a stranger, while the judge who had ruled against him sat in the background. Scarlett sat beside him, small and silent, watching him process it all. Who is the man in the photo? David finally asked, his voice controlled but tense. Scarlett shrugged. I don't know his name, but I know what he does. He makes people disappear. David's stomach clenched. Disappear? Not like that, she clarified. Not murder or anything. But problems, obstacles, people who get in the way, he takes care of them. David exhaled, trying to control the storm inside him. If this was true, if Melissa had enlisted someone to rig the custody case, then it meant his daughter had been stolen from him, not just taken by the courts. And that changed everything. How do you know all this? He asked, turning to look at Scarlett. She hesitated. I see things people don't. That's not an answer. She bit her lip as if weighing how much to say. Then, with a small sigh, she leaned back against the seat. I live on the streets, Mr. Foster. People don't pay attention to kids like me. I sit outside cafes, alleys, bus stops. People have conversations right in front of me like I don't exist. David felt a strange pang in his chest at that. And one night I saw your ex-wife meet with that man. I listened. She told him she couldn't take chances with this case, that she needed a guarantee, and he said, it's already handled. David's blood ran cold. You're sure? Scarlett nodded. Melissa paid him to make sure the case was decided before you even stepped into that courtroom. David clenched his jaw. He had spent months trying to prove that he was the better parent, believing the court would see the truth. And all that time, Melissa had already won, but not anymore. I need to know who that man is, David said, his voice steady now, resolved. Scarlett's dark eyes flickered. There's someone who might know. 20 minutes later, David found himself in a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of the city. The place smelled like burnt coffee and stale grease. A few truckers sat at the counter, nursing cups of black coffee at Ha. A booth in the back. A man waited. He was in his late 50s, grizzled with the look of someone who had seen too much and cared too little. Patrick Collins, Scarlett said, nodding toward him. David slid into the seat across from him, studying the man carefully. You're the one looking for ghosts? Patrick asked, voice gruff. I'm looking for the man in this photo, David corrected, sliding it across the table. Patrick barely glanced at it before letting out a quiet chuckle. You've stepped into a mess you're not ready for, Foster. David didn't blink. "Tell me who he is." Patrick exhaled and leaned back. "His name is Vincent Scott. He's not just some fixer. He owns people, judges, politicians, businessmen. You don't deal with him unless you're prepared to lose everything." David's hands curled into fists. "Melissa paid him to rig my case." Patrick shrugged. "Sounds about right. He makes sure the right people get what they want. And if they don't—" He let the sentence hang. David felt his chest tighten. "Can you prove it?" Patrick smirked. "Proof is dangerous, Foster, and people who dig for it usually end up buried." Scarlett spoke up. "You owe me, Patrick." David glanced at her, surprised by the sharpness in her tone. Patrick sighed. "Damn kid," he muttered, rubbing a hand down his face. Then, looking at David, he said, "All right, I might have something. But if you go down this road, there's no turning back." David met his gaze, unwavering. "I'm already in." David Foster had always played by the rules. He built his empire through hard work and persistence, believing that integrity would carry him through any battle. But now the rules had been rewritten. The game was rigged, and if he wanted to get Lily back, he had to fight fire with fire. Patrick Collins leaned back in the diner booth, arms crossed, watching David carefully. The dim neon light above flickered, casting shadows across the grizzled investigator's face. "You want to take down Vincent Scott?" Patrick said, voice low. "That's not something you do in a day, Foster. Men like him don't make mistakes." "Everyone makes mistakes," David countered. "You just have to know where to look." Patrick let out a humorless chuckle. "All right. Since you're so eager to burn your life to the ground, here's what I know." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Scott doesn't just buy people. He keeps records, insurance, in case one of his friends decides to betray him. He has dirt on judges, CEOs, politicians. If we find his ledger, we find proof that Melissa paid him off." David's pulse quickened. "Where does he keep it?" Patrick exhaled. "I don't know for sure, but he has a private office downtown. Tightly secured, cameras, guards. You don't just walk in and ask for a copy." David clenched his jaw. He had never broken the law in his life, but after what had been done to him, to his daughter, he had no choice. "Then we're not walking." And Scarlett, who had been sitting quietly, suddenly smirked. "I know how to get inside." Patrick raised an eyebrow. "Of course you do." David turned to her, his voice firm. "How?" Scarlett shrugged. "I know people." David narrowed his eyes, but she didn't elaborate. "You just lost your daughter in court, Foster," Patrick reminded him. "You sure you want to go down this road?" David met his gaze unshaken. "I don't have a choice." It was after midnight when David found himself standing in a dark alley behind one of the most secure buildings in the city. Patrick had managed to pull some strings, getting them a narrow window, before the security shift change. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Scarlett crouched near a side door, working her magic with a rusty lockpick she had probably been using since she was 5. "Where the hell did you learn that?" David whispered. "Survival school," Scarlett muttered. "Now shut up." A faint click and the door creaked open. "We're in," she whispered. David took a breath and stepped inside. The hallway was dark, lined with security cameras. Patrick had disabled them remotely, but they had minutes at best. "The cardinal office is on the top floor," Patrick had said. "Scott keeps his most valuable records there. Get in, get out, don't get caught." David moved swiftly through the corridors, his heart hammering. This was madness. He was a businessman, not a criminal. And yet, here he was. They reached the stairwell. Scarlett moved fast, her small frame barely making a sound. David followed, adrenaline pumping. They reached the top floor. A large wooden door stood at the end of the hallway. Vincent Scott's office. David reached for the handle. Locked. Scarlett pulled out her lockpick again, but before she could use it, the elevator at the far end dinged. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. David's breath caught. "Security, hurry!" he whispered. Scarlett's hands worked frantically. Another click. The door swung open. David shoved her inside, closing the door behind them just as the guards turned the corner. They stood in darkness, barely breathing. Footsteps passed by. Silence. Then Scarlett exhaled. That was close. David ignored her, moving toward the large desk in the center of the room. Papers were stacked neatly, but it was the safe in the corner that caught his eye. That was where Scott's secrets were kept. "We need that open," David said. Scarlett looked at him. "I don't do safes," David cursed under his breath. Time was running out. He grabbed a paperweight from the desk, raised it high. "Wait!" Scarlett hissed. "That'll trigger the alarm." David froze. She moved quickly, checking the drawers, flipping through files. Then her fingers brushed over a notepad. Numbers? A passcode? She turned to David, grinning. "Try this." David punched the numbers into the keypad. Beep, beep, beep. Click. The safe unlocked. David's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside, stacks of folders, ledgers, files, everything Scott had on everyone. He flipped through them fast, and then, there it was, a document showing a direct transfer from Melissa Walker to one of Scott's offshore accounts. Proof. David stared at it, his heart racing. She had paid for the verdict. He turned to Scarlett. "We have what we need, let's go." But just as he closed the safe, the office door burst open, a gun cocked, a deep voice filled the room. "Going somewhere?" David turned slowly. Vincent Scott stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 armed men. Scarlett froze. David's blood ran cold. They had been caught. The office door slammed open, and David's breath caught in his throat. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped inside, flanked by 2 armed guards. He was dressed in an expensive suit, his dark eyes scanning the room with the sharp precision of a predator assessing its prey. His movements were slow, deliberate, the kind of man who never had to rush because the world bent to his will. Vincent Scott. David had only just learned his name, but the moment he saw him, he knew exactly who he was dealing with. The fixer, the shadow in the background, the man who had stolen his daughter without ever stepping foot in a courtroom. Vincent shut the door behind him with a quiet click. The sound felt louder than the gunmetal grey pistol one of his men had just drawn. "You're more desperate than I thought, Foster," Vincent said smoothly, as if they were old acquaintances catching up over dinner. His voice was calm, too calm. David forced himself to stand tall, refusing to show fear. He wouldn't give this bastard the satisfaction. "Didn't expect to see you here, Scott," he said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. Vincent let out a quiet chuckle, stepping further into the room. He walked past David and Scarlett like they were insignificant, pouring himself a glass of whiskey from the crystal decanter on his desk. "I expected someone to come sniffing around eventually," Vincent admitted, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "But I have to say, I didn't think it would be you." He took a slow sip. "You don't strike me as the kind of man who plays dirty." "Foster." David didn't blink. "I wasn't, until someone stole my daughter." Vincent sighed dramatically. "Stole? No, that's not what happened at all." He turned, smiling like a snake. "You lost, and your ex-wife made sure it stayed that way." David clenched his jaw, his fists curling at his sides. Vincent nodded toward the safe. "I assume you found what you were looking for." David didn't answer. His heart was pounding, but he kept his face blank. He had the proof, hidden in his jacket. But if Vincent knew that, he wouldn't leave this room alive. Scarlett, who had been eerily silent, took a small step closer to David. "You have 2 options," Vincent continued, walking toward them. "One, you hand over what you took and we pretend this little misstep never happened." His smile faded. "Or 2, I make sure you never see your daughter again, in any way that matters." David's pulse spiked, but he refused to react. This was exactly what Vincent wanted, to make him afraid, to make him weak. "I have a 3rd option," David said. Vincent raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "I walk out of here. And in the morning, every judge, every reporter, every politician in this city gets a little package detailing exactly how you operate." For the first time, Vincent's smile faltered, just a flicker. But David saw it. A long silence stretched between them. Vincent exhaled, setting his whiskey down. "You think you've won something here?" "I don't think," David said, his voice steel. "I know." Vincent's eyes darkened. He flicked his wrist. One of his guards raised the gun. Scarlett tensed beside. "David, this was it, then boom!" The door burst open. Patrick Collins, gun raised. Let them go, Patrick growled. Vincent turned slowly, unfazed. He barely glanced at the weapon. Collins, he mused, as if greeting an old friend. I should have known you were behind this. You always did have a bad habit of sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Funny, Patrick said. I was about to say the same thing about you. David didn't hesitate. While Vincent was distracted, he grabbed Scarlett's wrist and bolted. Vincent shouted, his men lunged, but Patrick opened fire. The guards dove for cover. David and Scarlett raced down the hallway, their footsteps echoing. In the vast empty building, "Move, move, move!" Patrick yelled, covering them as they ran for the stairwell. Bullets ripped through the walls, shattering glass, splintering wood. David's breath burned in his lungs, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. They burst through the emergency exit, sprinting into the night. Cold air, sirens in the distance. Freedom. David clutched the stolen documents to his chest as they disappeared, into the darkened streets. David's pulse hammered as he and Scarlett ran through the darkened streets, their breath visible in the cold night air. Every step felt like borrowed time. Behind them, Patrick trailed, gun in hand, scanning for threats. They had the proof, a document tying Melissa to Vincent Scott's dirty dealings. But now, they were being hunted. "Where's the car?" David panted. 3 blocks, Patrick said. Scarlett groaned. "Might as well be 30. David tightened his grip on her wrist, pulling her forward. A deep roar of engines echoed in the distance. Vincent's men were already searching for them. They cut through an alley, hearts racing. The distant hum of approaching cars made David's stomach twist. They were closing in. Finally, they spotted the car. Patrick yanked the door open, motioning frantically. "Get in!" David shoved Scarlett inside and climbed in after her. The moment the doors slammed shut, Patrick floored the gas. Tires screeched. The sedan lurched forward, disappearing into the night. Across town, Melissa Walker's hands shook as she held the phone to her ear. "He has the files." Vincent's voice was controlled but sharp. Melissa's stomach dropped. "That's impossible," she hissed. "Is it?" Vincent's tone turned ice cold. "Because your ex-husband is still breathing. And now he's got enough to destroy both of us." Melissa's fingers dug into her palm. She had won custody, secured her power. How had David managed to claw his way back? "Fix this," she snapped. Vincent exhaled slowly. "I don't take orders." "Melissa, but you might want to prepare for the worst." For the first time, she felt it slipping away. David had the upper hand. At a rundown motel, David pressed his back against the wall, trying to catch his breath. "We go public at dawn," Patrick said, tucking his gun away. "Press, legal filings. Melissa won't be able to hide from this." David nodded. He had spent months fighting a losing battle. Now he had the truth, and he wasn't letting it go. Scarlett, silent until now, suddenly sat up. "We have company." David turned toward the window. A car pulled into the lot, headlights cutting through the darkness. Patrick cursed. They had been found. David's body went rigid as the car's headlights flooded. The motel parking lot. "Stay low," Patrick muttered, already reaching for his gun. Scarlett pressed herself against the bed, eyes locked on the window. The tension in the room was suffocating. David's heart pounded. If Vincent's men were outside, they wouldn't leave empty-handed. For a moment, nothing happened. The car idled, engine humming. Then, the doors opened. David held his breath. A woman stepped out. Melissa. David's chest tightened. He had expected Vincent's men, not her. Patrick swore under his breath. "She came herself? That's bold." Melissa moved slowly like a cat stalking prey. She knew they were watching. A knock echoed against the door. "David." Her voice was smooth, coaxing. "We need to talk." Scarlett tensed beside him. "You're not actually opening it, right?" Patrick kept his gun raised. "She's stalling. Scott's probably got men nearby." David exhaled sharply. Melissa was desperate, and that meant she was afraid. He made a decision. "Let me handle this." Patrick's jaw clenched. "Foster—" But David was already moving. He cracked the door open just enough to meet Melissa's gaze. She looked different. Not the composed, untouchable woman who had walked out of that courtroom victorious. She looked shaken. "You shouldn't have done this, David." He gritted his teeth. You shouldn't have stolen my daughter. Melissa's eyes darkened. You don't understand what you've started. I understand perfectly, he shot back. I have. Proof? Tomorrow everyone will know the truth. A flicker of something dangerous crossed her face. Do you really think this ends with a courtroom? She whispered. Vincent won't let you win. David's jaw tightened. Then he'll go down with you. Melissa's lips parted like she wanted to argue. But then, the sound of distant sirens pierced the night. Her eyes widened. David smirked. Didn't expect that, did you? Patrick had called. The police! Melissa stepped back. For the first time she looked afraid. She turned, rushing toward her car. Scarlett appeared beside David, watching her flee. She's running. No, David corrected, his voice steady. She's losing. He turned, back inside. The next move was his. Tomorrow the world would know everything. David stood in front of the cameras, the city buzzing with the weight of the truth. Microphones surrounded him, reporters shouting questions, flashes lighting up the early morning. Just the night before, Patrick had delivered the evidence to every major news outlet. Financial documents, records of Melissa's transactions, witness statements. It was all out in the open now. Melissa Walker's perfect world was crumbling. The news cycle erupted. Custody case corruption scandal, mother bribed court officials. Millionaire's battle for his daughter takes shocking turn. David Foster. Break silence. I will fight for Lily. The weight of it spread like wildfire. Melissa, once untouchable, now had cameras outside her house, journalists at her door, the entire country questioning her innocence. And Vincent Scott? Gone. By morning his offices were emptied, his associates refusing to comment. The man had vanished into the shadows. David didn't care. Scott was a ghost now. His real fight was just beginning. He stepped forward, looking into the cameras. I trusted the system to do what was right. It failed me. But today the truth is out. I won't stop until my daughter is back where she belongs. He meant every word. The world was finally listening. 2 months later, the courthouse was quiet this time. No press, no chaos, just the final step in a long, exhausting war. David sat beside his lawyer, waiting for the judge's decision. It had been months of hearings, investigations, character witnesses. Melissa sat across from him, a shell of the woman she used to be, her power, her wealth, her reputation, gone. The world had turned against her, and now the courts would too. The judge cleared his throat. After extensive review of the new evidence and the circumstances surrounding the original ruling, this court grants full custody of Lily Peterson to her father, David Foster. Parental rights of Melissa Walker are hereby revoked. David closed his eyes. It was over. For real this time. Outside, Lily ran into his arms. We can go home now, she whispered. David held her tight. Yeah, baby, we're going home. A few feet away, Scarlett leaned against the car, watching them. David turned to her. You know, we never talked about what's next for you. Scarlett smirked, but there was hesitation in her eyes. For the first time, she wasn't sure what to do. I don't know, she admitted. Well, David said, if you're tired of running, you might want to stick around. Scarlett glanced at Lily, who gave her a hopeful smile. After a long beat, Scarlett sighed. Guess I could use a change. David grinned. They got into the car. As they pulled away from the courthouse, David realized something. This wasn't just a win. It was a second chance for all of them, and for the first time in years he knew one thing for sure. They were finally free.